and welcome back to my channel. I am super excited for today's video because I'm going to be using another one of my fabrics that I got from Japan. It is this one with a really pretty purple color, and I think it would make a really nice blouse. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. To make my pattern, I just kind of measured myself and drew that out. I knew that I wanted it to be a v-neck and not very fitted, so I made the v-neck go as deep as I wanted it to, and then made the width of the top wide enough so that it would be somewhat flowy. And for the arm curves, I used a top I already had to draw it out, and I also made sure to make the shoulder curves slope downwards. The back was pretty much the same, except I made the neckline much shallower and the arm curves not as deep into the top. I cut that out, and then for the sleeve pattern, I used the sleeves of a top which I wanted a similar sleeve to, and based it off of that to make this sleeve. I cut all of these pieces out on my fabric, and as I mentioned before, the back is very similar to the front, so I used the front pattern to cut out the back and just made sure to adjust the necessary parts. I also cut out the neck ribbon / collar thingy, which was just a long rectangle, and I did have to make it in two pieces because my fabric wasn't long enough to make the whole thing one piece. But when I was cutting out the sleeves, I made a bit of a mistake and cut it on the wrong fold, but it kind of just ended up being a blessing in disguise because it allowed me to put a cool slit in the sleeve. I did end up having to cut out double the sleeve pieces that I originally would have needed, but I had plenty of fabric, so that wasn't much of an issue. This is the front piece, this is the back piece, these are the neck pieces, and these are the sleeves. Once all the pieces were cut out, I first sewed together the shoulder and side seams. I used French seams here, which is where you sew the fabric wrong size together before trimming the seam allowance and sewing it again right size together in order to encase the raw edges. This fabric was very delicate, so I had to be pretty careful with it in the sewing machine. I've been having so much fun using the fabric I got from my trip to Japan, and I really wish there was a fabric store as big as the ones there near where I live. To be fair, I don't exactly live in a big city, but when I become a fashion designer, hopefully I'll have access to all the fabric I want. Next, I went to work on the collar / neck ribbon thing. Since mine was in two pieces, I first sewed them together so it was one really long piece. Then I added interfacing to the center for as long as the back neckline was, plus a little extra. So basically, to get my interfacing length, I measured out the back neckline and cut out my interfacing with that length by the width of the neck thing. And though I cut it out slightly bigger because I find that interfacing does shrink a bit when heated. Then from there, I folded the neck piece in half right sides together and sewed all along the edge, but keeping the interfaced portion open, which is right in the center, so you can sew from each end to the center until you reach the interfacing. And then I also made a diagonal on the two ends to give it a nicer look when tied into a ribbon. One thing I've noticed is that recently I've been buying a lot of purple fabric. I didn't even notice this until I took a look at my fabric stash and realized there was so much purple. I kind of just get fabrics that I'm drawn to, and I guess it's purple I'm drawn to. To be fair, I do have a lot of purple things, and I'm even wearing a purple shirt in this shot right here. Do you ever have anything like this? If you do, leave it in the comments and I'd love to know about it. And before I forget, I added in my little tag to what will end up being the inside of the collar. And this is just some more footage of me sewing the other side of that ribbon thing. Once I turn it inside out, I have this nice long piece that we can attach to the blouse. When turning it inside out, make sure to trim the corner seam allowances so it doesn't look bulky. I pinned the part of the collar that will end up being on the outside of the blouse to the right side of the back of the blouse and sewed across. After ironing the seam allowance into the neck piece, I folded in the other side of the collar to hide all the raw edges and top stitch across to make everything nicely encased. As my channel grows, I'm really interested to know what kind of people watch my videos. Is it other home seamstresses that enjoy making their own clothes? Or do you guys just enjoy watching others make clothes? Or do you have professions in the fashion industry? I'd really love to know because personally I want to eventually have a profession in the fashion industry. And it would be very interesting and helpful to know your stories. Now that the collar was done, I needed to make some sort of finishing to the v-neck, so I just decided to bind it. As I mentioned before, this fabric was very delicate and stretched very easily, so I needed to make this neckline secure so that it wouldn't stretch in the future. I cut out 3 strips and interfaced all of them. I triple folded one of them and just sewed that one on one side of the v-neck. But for the other side, I had 2 separate pieces that I sewed together to make the binding because I needed to keep one end open so that it could cover up the very center corner of the v-neck. So this is what the first side looked like. But besides that, I sewed the other side in the same way, folding over the 2 raw edges and putting it over the edge of the v-neck and top stitching it in place, making sure I cover up the raw edge of the other binding. I also made this binding go a little bit into the interfaced portion of the collar so that the whole neckline would have continuous interfacing, keeping it secure. So this is me showing how I didn't sew all the way to the end of the other binding. And with this little open portion, I can use it to make the V in the V-neck. And this is how it looked once it was all sewn in. Now I could go on to the sleeves. So with the way I cut it out, each sleeve had 2 pieces, so I decided to use that to make a slit going down the bottom half of the sleeve. I sewed the top seams together until about halfway down. Then for the rest, I ironed over the seam allowance and top stitched it in place. And this is how the slit looked like. I know it looks a little bit messy, but again, this fabric was really thin and stretchy and just really hard to sew nicely with the sewing machine, so that's why it looks that way. I really wish I could have made it look nicer. But after that, I just sewed the bottom seams of the sleeve using French seams. And now I just attached the sleeves onto the top. Somehow the armscye was the perfect size to the sleeve, which was really nice, though originally I did intend for the sleeves to be slightly gathered on. But it was fine because I think it still had the same look I was going for, but with less work. I did use French seams for this as well. French seams don't always work the best for sleeves because it is on a curve, but for this it worked really nicely. And I like to use French seams as much as I can, especially for thin fabrics, because it gives it a much stronger seam. And I somehow sewed on the sleeve with the seam going the wrong way the first time I sewed it, so I had to unpick the whole French seam, which has 2 lines of stitching. And then when I re-sewed it on, I somehow sewed the sleeve on upside down. I've never done this before, so it was super frustrating, but eventually I was able to do it right. And you know, with anything you do, you're gonna make mistakes, which you learn from. And from now, I know I'm going to be extra careful when sewing on sleeves because I know how frustrating it is when I keep having to redo something I already know how to do just because I wasn't paying enough attention. I chose not to hem the sleeves because I wanted to keep it nice and flowy, but I did hem the bottom of the blouse. And once that was done, the blouse was all finished. I really like the design of this blouse and the flowy fabric that was used, but I would definitely say that the stitching could have been much better. If it was better, I would love this blouse even more. It was just really hard because everything kept stretching when I tried to sew it on. But hopefully I'll eventually figure out how to nicely sew these kind of fabrics. Thank you so much for sticking to the end of this video, and I hope I'll see you again next time.